How does a country go from being one of the poorest nations on Earth to the black gold powerhouse of Africa in a matter of years? Well, that's what we're here to find out. Because as you'll notice in a few minutes, Libya is a land of massive puzzles. You've got a desert that covers 90% of its map, and a political scene that keeps the whole world on its toes. So if you're ready to peel back the layers of Libya's story, keep watching. Thousands of years ago, Libya's mostly empty Sahara interior was roamed by Berber tribes. These were the nomadic folks who've called this place home forever. But around the 7th century BC, Phoenicians sailed in from the sea and set up shop in western Libya, or what they called at the time, Tripolitania. These traders loved the spot for many reasons actually, but the main one's got to be for its coastal access. Now let's fast forward to the 6th century BC, and Carthage, those powerhouse Phoenician descendants, enters the picture and takes control of Tripolitania, turning it into a bustling hub. Then, in the 4th century BC, the Greeks eyed the east, colonizing Cyrenaica and dubbing the whole region Libya, which, fun fact, is actually their word for the Berber people. Now you know the drill by now, because usually when the Greeks are involved, there's another major civilization at play, and that would be the Romans, which entered the picture around 74 BC. They conquered everything, linking Tripolitania and Cyrenaica into their North African province. And you know what they say? All roads lead to Rome. This one is no different. You'll see Roman roads, aqueducts and amphitheatres everywhere, but that's not even the most impressive part. Because at the time it wasn't the structures that mattered. It was all about control and taxes. Naturally, the Romans had all the power. That is, until 643 AD, when Arab armies under Amr ibn al-As stormed in, conquering Libya and planting the seeds of Islam, along with the Arabic culture and language. By now you're probably getting the big picture, right? Libya's being conquered left and right. And even when the 16th century rolled around, they're still being dominated by other empires. This time around it's the Ottoman Empire. And what they did was they united Tripolitania, Cyrenaica, and the desert south, known as Fezzan, into one regency ruled from Tripoli. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The pirates arrived and made Tripoli a notorious base, raiding Mediterranean ships until Spain nipped them in 1510, only for the Ottomans to grab it back in 1551. Then, from 1911 to 1912, Italy snatched Libya from the fading Ottomans during the Italo-Turkish War. By this time, the Libyans had had enough foreign rule. So what did they do? Omar al-Mukhtar, a fierce Islamic scholar, launched a 20-year guerrilla insurgency. When the 1920s happened, that insurgency turned into a full-blown resistance. But Italy crushed that brutally by 1931, with massive operations, concentration camps, and public executions. And Mukhtar himself was hanged that same year. Then in 1934, Mussolini declared Libya a full colony, pushing Italian settlers as part of his dream of a greater Italy. A few years after that, World War II happened, and by 1942, the Allied forces booted the Italians out. The once harmonised Libya was divided again. The Brits took Cyrenaica and Tripolitania, and the French took Fezzan. Now you might be wondering, well, what happened after that? Let me tell you. Post-war, the UN stepped in and essentially pushed Libya towards independence. So, in 1951, King Idris took the throne, and Libya finally became the very first country to gain its independence through the UN. Not long after, they hit the jackpot, because in the mid-50s they found oil, and by 1961, massive pipelines were pumping what they called black gold from the desert straight to the Mediterranean Sea. Suddenly, Libya was one of the biggest players in the global energy game. But, as you can probably guess, that kind of wealth often brings a bit of drama. So, in 1969, while the king was away, a young ambitious colonel named Muammar Gaddafi led a bloodless coup and took over. He wasn't interested in being a traditional leader. Instead, he wanted to shake things up. How did he do that? First off, he kicked out foreign military bases, took control of the oil for himself, and even tried to merge Libya with Egypt and Syria, though that didn't exactly work out the way he planned. By the 70s, he launched what he called a cultural revolution and wrote a famous little green book that explained his vision for a state of the masses. Sure, it sounded like democracy on paper, but in reality, it was pretty much all Gaddafi all the time. That's not the biggest turning point though, because things got pretty wild globally after that. Throughout the 80s, Libya was constantly bumping heads with the West. Imagine, there were dogfights with US jets, broken ties with the UK, and in 1986, President Reagan even ordered a bombing raid on Tripoli. All that tension hit a breaking point in 1988 with the tragic Lockerbie bombing in Scotland. The world pointed the blame at Libya, and the UN gave it a heavy punishment by cutting it off from everyone else for years. It stayed that way until the late 90s when Gaddafi decided to play nice, meaning he handed over suspects for the bombing, took responsibility, and even gave up his weapons of mass destruction program. Honestly, that was a good call on his part because after that, leaders like Tony Blair were visiting Libya and the oil money started flowing again. For a minute there, it looked like Libya was back in the global fold. Gaddafi was even chairing the African Union and dreaming of a United States of Africa. But under the surface of all that progress, people were getting tired of his 42-year rule. So, when the Arab Spring protests swept across the region in 2011, Libya caught the spark, and the protests in Benghazi turned into a complete revolution. With the help of NATO airstrikes, the rebel forces eventually took the capital, and by October, Gaddafi's long reign ended in his hometown of Sirte. At long last, it was the end of an era, but as the militias began to clash over what came next, it was clear that building a new country was going to be just as tough as overthrowing the old one. What a ride, am I right? But believe it or not, we're just getting started. Up next, we're tackling Libya's geography, starting with its massive size. Libya's about 1.76 million square kilometres. That's roughly 679,000 square miles, which means Libya is the fourth largest country in all of Africa. But with all that space available, the majority of it is taken up by the Libyan desert. It's an expansive, flat plateau that's part of the Sahara. Plus, it's so dry that there isn't a single permanent river flowing across the land. So how does the country compensate? Well, they built the Great Man-Made River in 1991, which is a giant web of underground pipes that brings fresh water from deep under the sand to the cities on the coast. Even with that, though, most of the country is still considered a scorching, barren wasteland. As such, almost everyone lives up north along the Mediterranean Sea, where the breeze keeps things a bit cooler. And if you're worried about how 7.3 million people live in one area, don't be, because that coastline is divided into two completely different worlds. To the west, you've got Tripolitania, which feels a lot like its neighbours, Tunisia and Morocco. Then to the east, you have Cyrenaica, which looks more like Egypt and the Middle East. So, let's break these down, shall we? If we look at Tripolitania in the northwest, it's home to the capital, Tripoli, and a fertile plain called Al Jafara. Then, if you head inland, the flat ground suddenly turns into a steep cliff leading to the Nafusa Mountains. These limestone peaks stretch for 340 kilometres, or about 211 miles, and reach heights of 1,000 metres, or 3,200 feet. Now, if you hop over to the east, you'll land in Cyrenaica, where you'll find Libya's lowest point at Sabkat Guzayil, sitting 47 metres, or 154 feet below sea level. Besides that, this region is famous for the Jebel Akhdar, or the Green Mountains. This is the wettest spot in Libya, which experiences a lot of rain throughout the year. Because of that, it's covered in pine and juniper trees, and farmers grow everything there from potatoes to fruit. Okay, so we've talked about the east and the west, but what about the south? Well, that's where we find the region of Fezzan. Remember Fezzan? Yeah, it's the true North African outback. It's almost entirely desert, but it's dotted with stunning oases like Ubari and Saba, where life thrives around hidden pools of water. Then, as you move toward the southern borders with Chad and Niger, the land starts to climb until you hit the Taibesti Mountains. This is where you'll find the highest peak in the country, known as the Biku Biti, towering over 2,200 metres, or 7,400 feet, into the sky. Truly, it's a wild, empty and beautiful landscape that reminds you just how much variety is hidden in the Libyan sands. Now, geography's one thing, but how does Libya's economy and politics play into this? Well, let me tell you, when we talk about Libya today, it's like watching a high-stakes game of chess where everyone's playing on the same board but with different sets of rules. And as we move into 2026, the country is stuck in a bit of political limbo. Hear me out. Since 2025, it's been a year of backroom deals and political malaise, where the big players were getting tired of the same old chaos. So now you've got four competing visions fighting for the crown. In the east, you've got the Haftar family and their Libyan National Army trying to expand their control nationwide. Over in the west, Prime Minister Haftar-Dbeibah is working to secure a future for his government, even if it means ruffling some feathers among his own allies. Throw in the UN pushing for elections and the US looking for economic stability, and you've got a very crowded room. And don't even get me started on money. Because in Libya, politics and oil are basically the same thing. So with all that commotion happening politically, you can imagine that the economy is nothing short of a roller coaster. In 2024, the current account, which is like the country's bank balance with the rest of the world, turned from a 4.1% surplus to a 2.6% deficit. Why is that? Simply put, when oil production dips or global prices drop, Libya's wallet feels the impact immediately. That's usually what happens when you only rely on one thing. And for Libya, oil accounts for about 95% of its export earnings. So now you're probably wondering, well, how does that carry over to 2026? Great question. Right now, experts are cautiously optimistic, predicting a growth of about 2.9% if, and that's a big if, the oil keeps pumping and politicians stop fighting. It's actually looking good at the moment because, according to the Libya Review, the country's oil reserves stand at 48 billion barrels, making it home to the largest oil reserves in Africa. Meaning, if they play their cards right, they have the potential to be an incredibly wealthy country, surpassing their $48 billion GDP in 2025. But enough about the money talk, it's time to move on to the fun part. Culture. When you look at the people of Libya today, you're looking at a culture that's been baking in the sun for over 10,000 years. Archaeologists have found evidence of people living here as far back as 8000 BC, back when the Sahara was actually green and fertile. Since then, Libya has been a giant melting pot. Everyone from the Phoenicians, Greeks and Romans to the more recent Italian colonizers has left their mark, creating a unique North African vibe that you won't find anywhere else. And it's not just their ethnic background that's interesting. If you were to walk through cities like Tripoli and Misurata, you'd notice right away that Libyan society is quite traditional and deeply rooted in faith. Almost everyone is a Sunni Muslim, and that religion shapes the law and how people interact every day, from the way people dress to the way they socialise. As you'd imagine, the culture is fairly conservative, especially when it comes to gender roles. In some areas, you might hear about purdah. It's where women's spaces are kept separate from men's, but if there's one thing that brings everyone together, it's the food. Trust me. Libyan cuisine is legendary because it mixes Berber, Arabian, and Italian flavours into something totally mouth-watering. Again, since this is an Islamic country, don't expect to find any pork on the menu. What you'll find instead is a dish called bazin. It's this delicious, doughy barley bread that's usually served with a spicy lamb sauce, peppers, and tomato paste. To me, it's the ultimate Libyan comfort food. And the tea, it's unlike anything you've had. Because unlike English or Asian teas, Libyan tea is thick, frothy, and almost syrup-like. But similar to teas in other cultures, the locals prepare it in a very specific way. It's kind of like a ritual or an art form. Speaking of, Libyan culture really comes alive through art and music. In the southwest, the desert hides world-famous rock art that's so old and precious, it's on the UNESCO World Heritage List. And if we're talking about modern art, you've got artists like Ali Omar Ermes and famous poets like Khaled Matawa to appreciate. Oh, and the music. It's where both old and new come together, because it often uses traditional instruments like the darbuka drum or the oud, which looks like a pear-shaped guitar. Whether it's through art, the ritual of tea-making, or the high-stakes navigation of global politics, Libya proves that there is more than meets the eye beneath the Sahara. And while most people only see the headlines, you know the deep-rooted story of this country. So, if there's one hidden side of Libya you want to share with the rest of the world, what would it be? I'm actually curious to hear what you've got to say, so drop them in the comments below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.